You begin with the assumption that certainty is the natural conclusion of knowledge. You feel that once you have learned enough, reasoned enough, or argued enough, your position becomes secure. Yet if you pause, you notice something unsettling. Your sense of certainty often arises long before verification. It comes not from understanding but from familiarity. Al-Ghazali recognized this pattern early in his intellectual life. He observed that the mind often confuses repetition with truth and comfort with clarity. What you call certainty may simply be the mind resting inside its own assumptions. You start to see that conviction can harden into something rigid, something that stops movement instead of encouraging deeper inquiry. If certainty feels immovable, what prevents you from examining its roots? Al-Ghazali lived in an environment shaped by scholars, philosophers, jurists, and theologians. Baghdad was a center of debate, where reasoning was refined through constant argument. Every idea was tested, defended, and redefined through intellectual struggle. Yet within this world of sharp minds, Al-Ghazali noticed a hidden issue. The pursuit of knowledge often served reputation rather than truth. Certainty was not only a conclusion, it was a symbol of prestige. In this environment, the desire to know merged with the desire to be right. If intellectual competition sharpens thought, does it also sharpen pride? Al-Ghazali eventually confronted a disturbing realization. The tools he relied upon, sensation, memory, reason, were not as trustworthy as he had assumed. Sensory experience could mislead. Logical arguments could contradict. Memory could distort. Even the brightest scholars disagreed about fundamental truths despite using the same principles of reasoning. This led him to a deeper crisis. If the mind must use the mind to verify its own reliability, how can it prove anything without circularity? You begin to sense the same instability when you try to examine your own thoughts. Certainty starts to appear less like a foundation and more like a convenient pause in a much larger inquiry. If the mind doubts itself, where does certainty find its anchor? Reason is valuable, but Al-Ghazali saw that it operates within boundaries the mind rarely acknowledges. Reason organizes, clarifies, and analyzes, yet it cannot justify the premises upon which it depends. You rely on logic, but the validity of logic itself cannot be proven by logic without assuming what must be proven. When you look closely, you notice that reason guides thought but cannot secure absolute certainty. It describes relationships but cannot reach the core of truth by itself. This does not diminish reason, it simply places it in perspective. If reason depends on assumptions it cannot verify, can it ever claim final authority? Al-Ghazali redirected the search for certainty inward. He argued that truth is not established only by reasoning but by the condition of the mind receiving it. A biased mind distorts even sound logic. A restless mind misunderstands even simple principles. A defensive mind rejects what contradicts its identity. You begin to see that knowledge is not merely information. It is a reflection within consciousness. When thoughts are clouded by desire, comparison, fear, or pride, the reflection becomes distorted. Clarity requires not just reasoning but purification of intention and perception. Truth appears when the mind no longer imposes itself upon what it encounters. If knowledge is a reflection, what happens when the mirror is not clean? For Al-Ghazali, doubt was not the enemy of belief but its starting point. He saw doubt as a disciplined process of removing inherited assumptions. This kind of doubt is not destructive, it is investigative. You begin to turn inward, examining each belief without attachment to its comfort or familiarity. You realize that questioning does not weaken conviction, it refines it. You distinguish between what you believe because it is true and what you believe because it is familiar. Doubt becomes a tool that protects you from illusion. If doubt can strengthen truth, why does certainty fear it? You notice something subtle. Certainty becomes rigid not because the idea is flawless, but because the self becomes intertwined with it. When you identify with a belief, questioning it feels personal. The challenge is no longer about the truth of the idea but the security of your self-image. Al-Ghazali observed this mechanism even in the most learned scholars. He noticed that certainty often serves the ego more than the intellect. Pride grows quietly, not through arrogance, but through attachment. You defend your ideas because they reinforce who you think you are. You avoid doubt because it threatens your identity, not because it threatens truth. You begin to see how certainty becomes armor, protecting the self rather than clarifying reality. Pride does not appear as boasting. It appears as resistance, the refusal to reconsider, the impulse to defend, the unwillingness to be wrong. If your certainty arises from the truth, why does it fight so hard to protect the self? When you look deeper, you find that beneath every rigid certainty lies a quiet fear. Fear of error, fear of instability, fear of losing the ground upon which your identity stands. This is why questioning feels dangerous. You are not only questioning ideas, you are questioning the structure that supports your sense of self. Al-Ghazali understood that doubt becomes frightening when the ego is attached to what it knows. Yet he also recognized that this fear is precisely what blocks deeper understanding. Real certainty requires the courage to let inherited beliefs collapse if they cannot withstand examination. As you confront your own assumptions, you notice that some convictions weaken instantly when exposed to scrutiny. Others remain firm because they are grounded in something deeper than habit. Doubt separates the two. If what you believe cannot survive honest questioning, what was it that you were certain of? Once Al-Ghazali dismantled his own assumptions, he began rebuilding knowledge on a different foundation. He argued that genuine knowledge is not borrowed from consensus or authority. It must arise from inner verification. Understanding becomes real only when it is recognized directly, without relying on external approval. You begin to see how often you rely on agreement for certainty. You feel more confident when others validate your beliefs. You feel uneasy when your view is challenged, even if the reasoning remains sound. This reveals that much of what you call knowledge depends on social support rather than intrinsic clarity. Al-Ghazali insisted that truth is independent of recognition. A fact is not strengthened by praise nor weakened by rejection. When you stop looking outward for confirmation, the inner ground of understanding becomes stable. If knowledge is true, why does it require the agreement of others? Al-Ghazali discovered that the collapse of pride does not diminish the intellect, it liberates it. When the mind releases its need to be right, it becomes more capable of seeing clearly. The boundaries of reason become visible, not as failures, but as markers of where the mind must quiet itself. You begin to perceive the difference between mastery and humility. Mastery seeks control, humility seeks understanding. Mastery asserts, humility observes. Al-Ghazali realized that intellectual pride blinds the mind to its own limitations, while humility opens the path to genuine insight. When you acknowledge the limits of thought, you do not lose clarity, you gain it. Pride dissolves not through rejection but through precise self-understanding. The mind becomes a tool rather than an identity. If mastery is genuine, why does it disappear the moment its limits are revealed? Al-Ghazali reached a profound realization: truth cannot be possessed. When you claim ownership over knowledge, you convert truth into a personal object, something that elevates you, protects you, or distinguishes you. But truth itself has no owner. It does not belong to the one who discovers it. You begin to understand that the ego seeks to take credit for insight, but this act introduces distortion. Ownership creates pride, and pride creates resistance. Knowledge becomes clear only when the self does not interfere. When you no longer claim knowledge as personal property, The relationship between the knower and the known changes. Understanding becomes quiet, direct, unburdened by identity. You recognize truth not as something you hold, but as something you witness. If truth belongs to no one, what does it mean to say I know? As the inquiry reaches its end, you notice that certainty no longer appears as a rigid conclusion. It feels more like alignment, a quiet recognition of what is real. Thought does not force clarity, it makes space for it. Al-Ghazali's forgotten teaching settles into view. Knowledge becomes purified when the self steps aside. There is nothing left to defend, no identity to protect, no conclusion to display. What remains is a still awareness, recognizing truth without claiming it. If truth reveals itself when the thinker becomes silent, who is left to speak?